The coin was copper, bent at the edge, stamped with a human face that nobody out here recognized anymore. Myra had been saving it for 3 months. She'd pulled it from the mud under the docking struts after a supply freighter clipped the pier and spilled its cargo manifest across the bay. A single coin among lengths of synthetic cable, crates of dehydrated protein, and one very confused Tessel bird that had apparently stowed away from the inner colonies. She'd tucked it into her breast pocket and decided, without any rational basis for the decision, that she would spend it on something worth spending it on. That was before the rations dropped again. The fringe world of Vasa 9 did not get colony ships anymore. It got what the Keth Dominion decided to send it, and the Keth had decided, 17 years ago when they annexed the outer spiral, that a colony of 2,000 humans living in domed prefabs above a methane bog was worth approximately nothing. They sent a resupply shuttle twice a year. It arrived late. It left early. And the soldiers who climbed down from it had stopped bothering to learn anyone's name. Myra was 26. She had been 8 when the annexation happened. She remembered her father explaining it to her in the flat, careful voice he used when he was frightened, that they were going to be okay, that the Keth were not cruel, just indifferent, and that indifference was a thing humans had survived before. He died of a respiratory infection 4 years later, because the resupply shuttle that year had come 6 weeks late, and the medicine aboard had already been allocated to a Keth garrison station on the far side of the system. She kept the coin anyway. The claiming feast came once every 7 years on the Keth calendar, which nobody on Vasa 9 followed willingly but all of them observed, because the Keth enforced observation. It was the great ritual of the Dominion, the ceremony in which the Alpha King moved through the territories he held and showed himself to the peoples under his protection. That was the official word the Keth used, protection. Myra had heard it so many times it had lost all purchase on her, worn smooth as river stone. The feast was held in the main dome. The Keth garrison commander, a broad-chested male named Thresh, who wore his rank spines folded down in the formal resting position at all times, which Myra understood to mean, he considered himself always at peace and never in danger, which was its own kind of insult, had spent 3 weeks preparing the dome. Bunting in Keth colors, which were a deep amber and the particular green of new copper. Tables arranged in concentric circles according to status, which put the humans near the outer wall, which put them closest to the cold. The Alpha King would not attend in person. He never did. The claiming feast at a fringe post was conducted through a proxy, a traveling official of the royal court who wore the king's seal and spoke with the king's authority, and was, in every legal sense that the Dominion recognized, the king's voice. The proxy would conduct the rite of acknowledgement, the subjects would present themselves, and the Dominion would mark another 7 years of Vasa 9 on its ledgers. What nobody at Vasa 9 knew, because it was not the kind of thing the Dominion announced, was that King Caelveth of the Keth had been traveling the outer territories himself for the past 8 months. Not as king, as nothing, as a traveler. He had done this before, 3 times in his 30-year reign, and each time the reasons had been different. The first time he was young and arrogant and wanted to see what his generals were hiding from him. The second time he was grieving his bondmate and needed to disappear. The third time, this time, he had done it because he was tired in a way he could not name, the way a man gets tired not of work, but of what the work has cost him, and he thought that walking among the ones he ruled, unknown and unattended, might remind him of something he'd forgotten about why any of it mattered. He arrived at Vasa 9 4 days before the feast. He looked like what the fringe worlds produced. Thin, travel-scarred, with the particular hollow look of someone who had been moving too long between places that didn't want him. He wore a second-hand layering coat and a translation collar that was 3 generations behind the current model, which crackled slightly when he spoke. His rank spines, the bony ridge structures that ran from behind a Keth male's ears down to his collarbones, which were both antenna and status indicator and deeply personal anatomical territory, were folded flat and wrapped in the wide collar scarf that fringe travelers used to keep the cold out. Nobody looked at him twice. He found lodging above the parts exchange, a narrow bunk in a room shared with 2 dock workers and a Keth maintenance tech who didn't ask questions because she'd learned that questions on Vasa 9 led to answers she didn't want. He ate what was available, which was very little, and he listened. That was mostly what the traveling was for, listening to the texture of things that reports couldn't carry. The texture of Vasa 9 was quiet desperation dressed as routine. He watched the humans. He had always watched humans. They were the most recently absorbed of the Dominion's peoples, and therefore the most studied, the most argued over in the court, the most frequently the subject of policy papers that reached no conclusions. He had watched them in the capitals, where they'd adapted fastest and assimilated furthest, and were sometimes nearly indistinguishable from Keth in their mannerisms, which troubled certain members of his court in ways they found difficult to articulate. He'd watched them at the garrison posts, where they were more guarded, more angular, harder around the eyes. Here at the fringe, they were something else. They were just people trying to get through winter. He saw the woman on the second day. She was working the dock exchange, not the parts exchange where he slept, but the goods market near the secondary airlock, where the twice-yearly resupply crates were broken down and distributed. She had a ledger, actual paper, and she was recording what came off the crates with the focused attention of someone who knew that somebody was going to try to shortchange the colony, and that the only defense against it was an accurate count. She had dark hair pulled back with a piece of electrical wire. Her coat was patched at both elbows. She argued with the Keth supply officer in the officer's own language, haltingly but accurately, about a discrepancy in the protein allocation, and she won the argument. And when she won it, she didn't smile the way someone smiles at victory. She smiled the way someone smiles when they've just gotten the right answer on a calculation they weren't sure about. Like the winning was secondary to the correctness. Cale had spent 30 years watching people argue with his officers. Most of them either folded immediately or went loud and aggressive, which gave the officers an excuse to dismiss them. This woman had done neither. She'd made her case, documented it, and waited, like she'd done it before, like she planned to do it again. He found out her name from the dock worker in the bunk above him, who mentioned her without being asked, in the way people mention someone who's become load-bearing in a community, not with admiration exactly, just with the recognition that the structure would be different without her. Myra, the colonist ledger-keeper. She'd been doing the count for 8 years since her predecessor died. She didn't get paid for it beyond her standard colony ration, which was the same as everyone else's. The claiming feast fell on the 4th day. Cale attended in his traveler's coat and his crackle collar. He sat near the outer ring with the humans because that was where his station put him. The dome was cold, and the amber and copper-green bunting moved slightly in the recycled air, and the garrison commander Thresh gave a speech about continuity and strength, and the enduring bond between the Dominion and its peoples. Cale had approved a version of that speech himself, 14 years ago, and it had been slightly better then. The proxy ritual proceeded as designed. The court official, a young male named Esat who wore the king's seal with the carefulness of someone who understood the weight of it, moved through the concentric circles of attendees conducting the acknowledgement rite, which involved a formal exchange of breath between official and subject as a symbol of shared dominion. And then the subject was given a token of copper bearing the king's face, stamped in the Dominion's foundries, which was the official memento of the feast. Cale had always thought the copper tokens were slightly undignified. He had said so once to his chamberlain. The chamberlain had pointed out that metal currency was among the most universally valued objects across all the species of the Dominion, and that a token people could actually use for trade had more meaning than an abstract certificate. Cale had conceded the point. He was sitting near the outer wall, eating reconstituted grain broth that was, if he was being fair, not entirely without flavor, when he became aware that someone was looking at him. He glanced up. It was the woman from the dock exchange, Myra. She was standing at the edge of the human section with the particular expression of someone trying to determine whether a situation is their business or not, and having decided it is. He followed her gaze to his bowl. He looked at the bowl. He looked back at her. "When did you last eat?" she said. The question was so direct that it took him a moment to process it. Not the translation, his collar handled that even with its crackle, but the assumption behind it. She had looked at him, assessed the coat, the hollow temples, the too careful way he was rationing the broth, and she had reached a conclusion, and she had decided to act on it. "I ate this morning," he said. "Something with actual protein in it." "I had the grain ration," she said. "I know what the supply manifest says. There's not enough in a standard grain ration to keep someone your size functional if you've been traveling." She reached into her coat pocket and produced a copper coin. Not a claiming token, a human coin, old, bent at the edge, stamped with a face he didn't recognize. She set it on the edge of his table. "The exchange stall near the secondary airlock takes these. There's a woman there who does actual protein patties. Tell her Myra sent you." He looked at the coin. "I can't take your money." "It's one coin." "It's yours." She looked at him with the expression of someone who has already run this argument to its conclusion and knows she's right. "It's worth less than watching someone go hungry when I have it in my pocket and could do something about it. Take the coin." He took the coin. He sat with it in his hand after she'd walked away, back to her seat near the outer wall, back to the edge of the human section where she ate her own broth with the same focused economy she'd brought to the ledger count. The coin was warm from her pocket. It was, he realized, looking at it properly, a colonial-era mint coin from the early settlement period pre-annexation, which meant it was worth nothing legal and everything sentimental. She had carried it a long time. She had given it to a stranger who looked hungry without asking anything in return, or waiting to see if he'd say thank you. Kale was the alpha king of the Keth Dominion. He had been crowned at 17, had fought 2 internal succession wars, had absorbed 9 species into the Dominion's fold, had negotiated the Pax Caldera that ended 40 years of border conflict, and had been the recipient of more formal acts of respect and tribute than he could count or remember. What he was not accustomed to was being looked at by someone who saw him as simply a person who might need something, and giving him that thing because she had it and could. He closed his hand around the coin. He did not go to the exchange stall. He kept the coin. And he stayed on Vasa 9. He told his traveling companion, a bodyguard named Jorath who was very good at being invisible when required, less good at being patient, that the ship could wait another week. Jorath looked at him for a long moment with the expression of a man who has served long enough to know when to ask and when not to. He said nothing. He waited. Kale spent the week watching, which was what he'd come to the outer territories to do. But he watched differently now. He walked the dome settlement in his traveler's coat and his crackling collar, and he watched Myra do the work of keeping 2,000 people from losing too much to indifference and administrative neglect. She was not elected. There was no formal structure for colony representation in the Keth system, which had always been one of the quiet pressure points in his policy advisor's reports, the ones that ended with recommended action that never got acted upon because there were always larger fires. She was just the person who did the work, which meant she was the person people came to when something went wrong. The translation disputes, the medical supply allocation, the children's learning program that the Keth garrison didn't acknowledge and didn't officially fund and didn't shut down either, because shutting it down would require paperwork. She ran it out of a repurposed equipment bay on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, using terminals she'd salvaged from decommissioned survey equipment, and a curriculum she'd assembled from whatever she could access through the colony's limited data relay. He sat in on one of the sessions. He pretended to be waiting for someone in the corridor and watched through the open door. 12 children, ages perhaps 5 to 14, sitting on upturned storage containers, watching Myra draw star maps on a whiteboard with a marker that was running dry. She was teaching stellar navigation, actual navigation, not the simplified routes the Keth system licensed to non-Keth pilots. She was teaching them to read the dark between the stars the same way her people had learned to read it before the annexation. She had no textbook. She drew everything from memory. He thought about the curriculum. He thought about what it meant that she was teaching it. He went to find Joreth. "I need you to pull the full colony report for Vasa 9, he said. "Not the garrison summary, the raw administrative file." Joreth looked at him. "My lord, I know. We're not supposed to. I know." The file took half a day to decrypt through Joreth's secure access. Kale read it in the narrow bunk above the parts exchange with a lantern and his coat on because the heating in the room was unreliable. The file was everything the garrison reports had left out, which turned out to be almost everything that mattered. The medical deficit, the food calculation error that had been in the system since year 3 and had never been corrected, which meant every resupply calculation was wrong, which meant the colony had been systematically undersupplied by approximately 11% for 14 years. The infrastructure maintenance backlog. The flag administrative low priority sitting in a queue somewhere, requesting a formal colony representative structure that had been submitted. He counted 7 times in 17 years. 7 times, denied or more accurately never processed each time. He read Myra's name in the file exactly once, in a footnote, attached to the 7th representative request filed 3 years ago. The footnote said, "Request Coordinator, Myra Vassal, Colony Ledger Administration. Status, pending review." Pending review for 3 years. He lay back on the bunk and stared at the low ceiling and thought about the copper coin still in his pocket. On the 8th day, it went wrong. Thresh, the garrison commander, had been receiving reports about the fringe settlement's black market relay transmissions. The unofficial data channel the humans used to communicate with each other and with other human colonies, which technically violated 3 sections of the Dominion's communication charter, and which Thresh had been ignoring for 6 years because shutting it down was more trouble than it was worth. What had changed was that one of his junior officers had decided to make a name for himself by running an investigation without telling Thresh, and the investigation had, predictably, found the transmissions, and now Thresh had to do something about it, or the officer's report would go up the chain and become a garrison discipline issue. What he did was arrest the person whose name appeared most frequently in the transmission logs. Myra was in the colony's atmospheric control room when they came for her, not because she was hiding, but because the secondary filter array was throwing error codes again, and she was the one who'd learned how to reset it. She heard the garrison boots before she saw them. 4 soldiers, full kit, which was the kind of thing that should have meant an external threat, but on Vasa 9 meant something had annoyed someone with rank. She closed the filter panel and straightened up and looked at the officer in charge the way she looked at the supply officer during the count, and she said, "Can I help you?" They put restraint cuffs on her. She did not resist. But her eyes did something, went quiet, went very still, the way eyes go still when a person decides they will not give whoever is watching them the satisfaction of seeing them afraid. Kale was in the corridor outside. He had been heading to the atmospheric control room to tell her he'd found the calculation error and that it was fixable. Instead, he saw the garrison soldiers walking her out. He stood very still. Joreth materialized at his elbow. Joreth had a particular gift for materializing silently at critical moments. It was one of the things Kale had valued in him for 18 years. "My lord," Joreth said very quietly. "If you act now, the cover is gone." "I know. If the cover is gone." "I know, Joreth." He watched them take her around the corner toward the garrison building. He thought about 7 unanswered requests. He thought about 11%. He thought about a woman teaching star maps from memory because there was no textbook, to children sitting on storage containers because someone had to and she was there. He thought about the coin in his pocket. He had been trying to remember why any of it mattered. He thought he might have just remembered. He reached up and unwound the scarf from around his collar. His rank spines rose, fully extended, the way they hadn't been outside of formal court settings in 8 months. They were longer than most Keth males, and the particular coloration, deep amber banding over a bone-white base, was sufficiently distinctive that any Keth who saw them would know immediately what they were looking at. He straightened to his full height, which in a traveler's coat he'd been careful not to do, and he went around the corner after them. "Release her." The garrison soldiers stopped, turned, saw the rank spines first. That was always the first thing, and then the posture, and then something behind the eyes that was harder to define, but that soldiers, in Cale's experience, recognized faster than anyone else. The officer opened his mouth, closed it. "Commander Thresh," Cale said, directing it past the officer to the building entrance where Thresh had appeared, drawn by the sound of something unexpected. "Release her, rescind the order, and have your junior officer's investigation report sent to my traveling companion within the hour. We will discuss what happens to it from there." Thresh's rank spines went flat, all the way flat, chin to collarbone, the posture of deep formal submission that Keth didn't perform casually because it was physically uncomfortable. "My lord," he said, in a voice from which every ounce of garrison commander certainty had been completely evacuated. "The report," Cale said, "within the hour." They released her. Myra stood in the corridor with the restraint cuffs still faintly pink on her wrists, looking at him, looking at the rank spines, looking at the coat, looking back at the rank spines. He could see her putting it together, the traveler, the crackle collar, the bunk above the parts exchange, the narrow bowl of broth, the coin, and he waited for whatever was going to arrive at the end of that calculation. What arrived was, how long? 8 days here, 8 months in the territories. Traveling as nothing, he paused. "I do it occasionally." She looked at him for a long moment, not with awe, which was what he was used to, not with fear, which came second, with the expression she'd used at the dock exchange when she was making a calculation she wanted to get right. "The calculation error," she said, "in the food supply, you know about it. I read the administrative file last night. It's been wrong for 14 years. I know. People have been sick, children specifically, because the protein supply has been chronically 11% low for 14 years. You know that." "Yes," he said. She nodded, slowly, like she was filing something in a very specific place. "What are you going to do about it?" It was, he thought, perhaps the most direct question anyone had ever asked him, and he'd been asked a lot of questions. What happened next took 3 days and was not clean. The garrison officer's investigation report was, as Cale had known it would be, the kind of document that existed primarily to advance the officer's career at the expense of the people he'd been assigned to administer. He had Joreth send it back with annotations that the officer would find instructive. Thresh received a formal review notice that would take 6 months to resolve and would result, Cale had already decided, in a reassignment to a post where his particular combination of laziness and blind-eye turning could do less damage. The communication charter violation was processed as a technical infringement, the lowest possible category, and assigned a fine of 1 Dominion credit, which was approximately the value of a single copper token from the claiming feast, which Cale chose to see as the universe having a sense of humor. The calculation error was harder, It wasn't malice. That would almost have been easier to fix. It was a data entry mistake made in year 3 that had propagated through 14 years of resupply calculations without anyone catching it because nobody had been checking the source document. Correcting it forward was simple. Correcting the deficit, 14 years of 11% shortfall for 2,000 people, required a formal dispensation from the Resource Allocation Office and a supply convoy reorder, and a flag to the medical division about the documented health impacts, which Myra had been documenting, he discovered, in her own ledger for the past 6 years. Her own handwritten account of which children got sick at what times and how that correlated with supply cycles. She had been building a case, methodically, against a system she had no way to directly address. She gave him the ledger when he asked to see it. She handed it over with the directness she applied to everything, not without hesitation, but letting the hesitation pass through her quickly rather than stopping it at the door. The ledger was dense with her handwriting, cross-referenced with supply dates, careful and exact. At the back she'd started a section of names, colony members who had died in the 17 years since annexation. She didn't label it. It didn't need a label. This should have been enough, he said. It should have been enough 7 times, she said. He looked up from the ledger. She was sitting across from him in the equipment bay, her classroom, her storage room, her administrative office, her everything, with her hands flat on the table and the particular stillness of someone who has learned to sit with injustice so long that it no longer deranges them, which was not peace, which was something harder than peace. I know what it cost you, he said, to give me the coin. What it represented. She tilted her head slightly, not quite denial. It was a coin. It was what you'd kept. She looked at him for a moment. Then, it was also still just a coin. You looked like you needed something to eat more than I needed to keep holding on to it. He thought about that for a long time after, the complete absence of calculation in it. She hadn't done it because of what it might come back to her. She hadn't even done it because she decided she was the kind of person who did things like that. She'd done it because the need was there and she could address it, and to her the equation started and ended there. He'd ruled a dominion of 43 species for 30 years, and he could not think of a single act of pure, uncomplicated generosity he'd witnessed in the halls of power. Not one. On the 3rd day, Gator arrived. He was not actually called Gator. His name was something in the local patois that the colony translation systems rendered approximately as Gator, and he'd been on Vasa 9 longer than the colony, which was a piece of information Kale found both interesting and pointed. He was Keth, full blood, not mixed, but he'd been on the fringe so long that he'd gone feral in the Dominion's administrative sense. No registered address, no garrison affiliation, no tax record. He lived in the deep methane bog sectors where the dome structure thinned to near transparency, and the light came through in that particular coppery green that was exactly the color of the Dominion's bunting, which Kale had always found mildly oppressive. He came to Kale the way people came to power when they thought they'd found a shortcut through it, with something that was almost a proposition and just barely wasn't quite blackmail. He'd been watching Myra. He'd been watching her the way certain men watch women they've decided are owed to them, which was a specific form of ugliness that apparently crossed species lines with perfect fluency. He had ideas about what should happen with Myra now that the Alpha King's attention had landed on Vasa 9, and the garrison command structure was in flux, and the usual order of things had been disrupted. Kale listened to him for approximately 60 seconds. Then he said, very quietly, I want you to understand something. The woman you're describing is under the Dominion's formal protection as a colony administrator and documented grievance coordinator. Any action taken against her, or against the colony settlement under her informal administration, will be prosecuted under the Settlement Rights Charter, sections 11 through 19, which carry penalties I am confident you would find instructive. Gator looked at him. He had the eyes of someone used to the fringe, which meant he'd learned to evaluate threats quickly and react to them faster. He evaluated. He reacted. He left. Myra was watching from the doorway of the equipment bay when Cale turned around. She'd heard most of it. She had the expression of someone filing another entry in an internal ledger, this one unlabeled in a different way than the section of names. "Did he threaten you before?" Cale asked. "Not in ways he could be charged for." She paused. Garrison Command never seemed particularly interested. No, he thought about Thresh, about the report, about blind eye turning and its specific costs. It won't be a problem after today. She nodded, not gratitude exactly, something more like noted, filed, moved on. The way she moved on from everything, not because it hadn't mattered, but because stopping moving was what killed you on the fringe. The supply convoy arrived ahead of schedule. Joreth had been in contact with the Resource Allocation Office, which had discovered an urgency it hadn't previously been aware of. The convoy carried enough to correct the immediate shortfall and a message from the allocation director that was professional and careful, and said nothing about why the urgency had materialized now, but that Cale knew would be read correctly by everyone who received it. Cale walked the convoy in with Myra, who counted every crate personally and cross-referenced the manifest with her paper ledger, and caught two discrepancies, minor ones, possibly innocent, but she caught them anyway and got them corrected before the convoy offloaded. He watched her do this and thought, she has been doing this for 8 years. She has been holding this together for 8 years with paper and electrical wire and a bent copper coin, and the particular human stubbornness that his policy advisors wrote about in papers that used the word stubbornness as though it were a problem rather than what it actually was, which was the most reliable force he'd encountered in 40 years of governing. "I'm going to do something," he said, when the last crate was counted. "And I want to ask you before I do it." She looked up from the ledger. The representative request, formally submitted, formally processed, formally answered, not pending review. A colony administrator position with actual standing in the administrative structure, with direct communication access to the Resource Allocation Office and a dedicated channel to Dominion services. He paused. "It's what you've been asking for 17 years, with less formal vocabulary." She was very still. What would that actually mean, day to day? "It means the garrison can't ignore you. It means your ledger counts. It means when there's a discrepancy in the manifest, you have somewhere to send it that has to respond." He watched her face. "It means the next 14 years look different from the last 14. She was quiet for a long moment. Behind her, through the dome's translucent wall, the methane bog caught the light in copper and green. The two dockworkers from his room were hauling protein crates with the particular relief of people who haven't had enough and now have some, which was its own kind of language. "What do you want for it?" she said. "Nothing." She looked at him steadily. "Alpha Kings don't come to fringe worlds for nothing." "I came to remember something," he said. "I think I've remembered it." She waited. "I came to see what I'm supposed to be governing for," he said. "Not the reports, not the tallies, not the policy summaries. I needed to see what it actually looks like." He looked at the crates, at the dome, at the man who'd been in the bunk above him, carrying protein to a woman who'd been sick since autumn. A colony ledger keeper who does an accurate count when nobody's watching and builds a case for 11 years against a system that can't hear her yet and gives her last coin to a stranger who looks hungry. He paused. "That's what I came to see." Myra looked at him for a long moment. Then she did something he hadn't seen her do before. She laughed. It was short and a little exasperated and entirely genuine. "You're a very strange king," she said. "I've been told." He stayed 2 more days. He used them to do the administrative work that should have been done years ago, working with Joreth on secure channels to the relevant offices. The representative status was formalized. The garrison review triggered. The health impact documentation, Myra's ledger, photographed and transmitted to the medical division, flagged for formal investigation. He wrote the referral notes himself, which he almost never did, because he wanted to get the specific weight of each one exactly right. On the last morning before the ship was due to depart, he went to the equipment bay, the classroom. She was there alone, redrawing the star maps on the whiteboard. The marker had finally run completely dry, and she was using something else, a piece of ochre chalk that left a different color on the board, which she appeared to be incorporating into the lesson plan in real time. "The stars look different in ochre," he said from the doorway. "They work the same way," she said without looking up. He stood in the doorway. He had the copper coin in his hand. He'd had it there for 3 days off and on, turning it over and not deciding what to do with it. He set it on the edge of the table. She looked at it, looked at him. "I didn't spend it," he said. "I noticed." She picked it up. Examined the face on it, the old colonial mint, the governor of the pre-annexation settlement, a man whose name most people on Vasa 9 probably didn't know anymore. "Why?" "Because it meant something," he said, "and I didn't want to convert it into something it wasn't." She turned it over in her fingers. The edge was bent. The stamped face was worn at the cheek. "You could change things here," she said. "Actually change them, not just formal status and corrected manifests. The communication charter, the settlement rights categories, the resupply calculation system so it checks source documents." She wasn't looking at him when she said it. She was looking at the coin. The things that let it go 17 years in the first place. "Yes," he said. "Will you?" He thought about it, which was not the same as delaying. He thought about 43 species in 30 years and the accumulated weight of governance done from the center looking outward, and the particular way the fringe looked when you were standing in it instead. "Some of them," he said, "I can't promise all of them. There are things I don't control as directly as people assume." He paused. "But the source document check, the communication charter fringe exemption, the representative framework not just here piloted properly from here with documentation and then extended." He looked at her. "Those I will do." She nodded, still looking at the coin. "Keep it," he said. She looked up. "You gave it to someone you thought needed it more than you needed to keep it," he said. "I didn't need it more. I just needed to be reminded of what it was." He paused. "Keep it." She closed her hand around it, not dramatically, just quietly the way she did everything. He left. She didn't come to the dock to see him off, which was the right choice and the one he'd expected. Joreth was waiting at the ship with the expression of a man who has been patient for 8 months and is choosing to remain that way for the remainder of his professional life. "You're going to change some things," Joreth said, "not a question." "Some," Kale said. "For one colony. As a beginning." Joreth looked at him for a moment. Then he said, in the careful voice of a man who means it, "Good." The ship lifted out through Vasa 9 upper atmosphere at dawn by the colony's clock, which was set to a 26-hour cycle, calibrated to make the light feel approximately right even, though the planet's actual day was 19 hours, and the dome's artificial lighting filled the gap. That calibration had been a decision made by the original settlers, a small adjustment to make a strange place feel livable. Nobody had ordered them to do it. They'd just done it, because they were here and it was their home, and making it livable was what you did. Kale watched the dome get small through the viewport. The methane bog below it caught the rising light in that particular coppery green. The bunting was long gone, taken down the morning after the feast by humans who had other uses for the fabric. He opened his hand. He picked the coin up off the table when she wasn't looking. He wasn't proud of it. He stood with it in his palm and watched Vasa 9 fall away into the dark and thought she'd do it again. A different stranger, a different bent coin, same calculation. The need is there, I have something, therefore I act. No calculation beyond that. No ledger of reciprocation. Just the thing that needed doing and the person who could do it. 30 years, 43 species. 14 advisory councils and 600 policy papers, and the Pax Caldera, and 2 succession wars, and all the accumulated apparatus of governance. And the thing he'd come out here to remember turned out to be this: that the reason any of it mattered was the woman in the equipment bay drawing star maps in ochre chalk for children who didn't have a textbook yet. He put the coin in his breast pocket, next to where it had been warm. The stars came up around the ship as it left the system, familiar and indifferent and enormous. Navigation plotted the route home automatically. Joreth brought tea without being asked, and it was hot and slightly wrong, the way Fringeworld tea always was, and Kale drank it anyway, and it tasted, not entirely unlike something you'd keep. The formal representative status came through in 17 days, which was fast by Dominion standards and slightly miraculous by Vasa 9 standards, where things from the administrative center usually arrived like light from a star that had already changed true when it left, uncertain by the time it arrived. Myra received the certification through the colony's data relay on a Tuesday morning, which meant she was in the equipment bay with 11 children when the terminal chimed with an incoming document bearing the King's official cipher. She read it once. Then she asked the children to take a 10-minute break, and she sat with the document for another minute, alone, looking at the cipher. The seal was the same one that had been on the proxy official at the claiming feast, the stylized Kethwing above the doubled horizon line that she'd seen on every piece of Dominion communication since she was 8 years old. She had spent 17 years on the receiving end of what that seal meant when it arrived with a form letter or a denial, or a pending review notice. This one said, in formal Keth administrative language that she read carefully twice, because she'd learned to read administrative language carefully. Colony of Vasa 9, Settlement Designation 7 Outer 9, is hereby granted formal representation status under the Dominion Settlement Charter, Amendment 7B, with administrative standing in the Resource Allocation Office, Medical Division, and Fringe Settlement Development Bureau. The designated colony administrator is authorized to file grievances, requisitions, and documentation, requests directly through official channels with a mandated response period of 30 standard days. 30 days, not pending review indefinitely, 30 days. She looked at that for a while. Then she called the children back in and went on teaching star maps in ochre chalk, and she didn't say anything to them about the document, because the right time for that was later, when she understood better what it was going to mean in practice, and not just what it said on paper. She had learned that distinction early. Paper and practice were different territories. But that evening, after the session, she sat at the terminal in the equipment bay and opened a direct channel to the Resource Allocation Office using the credentials in the certification document. She composed a formal requisition for the medical supply backlog, the 14-year deficit she'd been calculating, item by item in the back of her ledger. She attached her documentation. She submitted it and received an automated acknowledgement with a case number and a 30-day response clock that started. The timestamp showed immediately. She sat back. She looked at the case number on the screen. It was just a number. It had no texture, no weight. It was 11 digits that meant a bureaucrat somewhere in the Dominion's administrative center now had a file on their desk with Vasa 9 name on it and a legal obligation to respond. She thought about what it had taken to get to 11 digits. 17 years and 7 requests, and a bent copper coin, and a stranger in a traveler's coat, who had turned out to be the most powerful individual in the known galaxy, sitting 2 tables away from her eating reconstituted grain broth. She laughed again, the same short, slightly exasperated, genuine laugh she'd given him at the dock. The equipment bay was empty. There was no one to hear it. That was fine. The medical convoy arrived in 41 days, which was 11 past the response deadline, which meant she filed a procedural notice citing the delay. The procedural notice received a response in 3 days, a formal apology, and a supplemental allocation to compensate for the delay, which had never happened to VASA 9 in 17 years of requests. The garrison sergeant who processed the convoy's arrival came to her with the manifest to check, which also had not happened before. Previously, she had always gone to them. Small things, the texture of things had changed. She noticed it in the other humans too, the particular adjustment of posture that happens when a community's sense of its own weight in the world shifts, however slightly. The dockworkers checked the supply crates with less of the resigned expectation of finding them short. The children in the equipment bay asked sharper questions. Old Gonzo, who had been on VASA 9 since year 1, and had developed a philosophy of absolute minimal engagement with the Dominion as a survival strategy, actually attended a colony meeting for the first time in 6 years and sat in the back and said nothing but stayed to the end, which from Gonzo was approximately equivalent to giving a speech. The garrison soldiers were different too. Not dramatically, there was no moment of revelation or adjustment of attitude. Thresh was gone, replaced by a commander named Vel who had come from a posting where she'd been working with a mixed-species colony for 4 years and had learned somewhere along the way that administration and occupation were not the same thing. She was not warm exactly, but she was precise, which was in some ways better than warm. Precise was reliable. Precise kept its word. Myra developed a working relationship with Commander Vel that was professional and occasionally slightly uncomfortable and generally effective, which was what she'd been working toward for 8 years without having the framework to make it happen. The communication relay remained technically in violation of the charter. The fringe exemption came through 14 weeks after Kale's ship left the system, a quiet regulatory amendment to the charter's communication provisions that created a new category for outer rim settlements under certain population thresholds, which didn't mention VASA 9 by name, but which applied to exactly one settlement in the current Dominion registry. Myra read the amendment when it came through the official channels. She read it twice, carefully, the way she read everything administrative. She thought about the conversation in the equipment bay before the convoy. She'd asked him what he would do. He'd said some of them. He hadn't promised all of them. The source document check was the last to come through, buried in a maintenance update to the resupply calculation system that was distributed to every garrison station in the outer territories simultaneously. She caught it in the update notes, 3 lines in technical language about validation protocols for origin documents in the food allocation pipeline. Unremarkable to anyone who wasn't looking for it. She'd been looking for it. She read those 3 lines for a long time. There was something that happened when a small thing you'd asked for that felt impossible to ask for arrived in the world quietly and without ceremony. No acknowledgement, no fanfare, just, it was changed and now it would work differently. She opened the ledger, the back section, the one with the names. She'd been maintaining it for 11 years, adding to it carefully when she had to, trying not to add to it. She looked at the last entry, a man named Boren, age 62, respiratory illness. 6 months ago when the winter supply shuttle arrived 3 weeks late and the supplemental medication hadn't been in the manifest. She closed the ledger. She put it in the bottom drawer of the equipment bay cabinet where she'd been keeping it since her predecessor died and left her the colony's records. She didn't throw it away. It was true, and true things needed to be kept, but she put it in the drawer. She stood in the equipment bay. In the equipment bay that was also a classroom and a records room and an administrative office, and whatever else it needed to be on a given morning. And she looked at the whiteboard with the ochre star maps, which she'd been carefully not erasing even as she added to them. She picked up the chalk. She started a new constellation section, one she'd been saving for when the children were ready, the outer spiral cluster that wasn't in the standard navigation templates, the routes her colony's original pilots had charted when they first came out here before anyone had told them what they could and couldn't fly. The routes that had existed in handwritten logs and been copied and preserved, and eventually ended up in her head. because she'd memorized them from her father's records the way you memorize the things that are important to someone you loved. The stars that nobody had formally told them they could navigate, the stars they'd mapped themselves. She drew them in ochre on the whiteboard, in the cold equipment bay, in the early morning before the children arrived, on a world that was still a fringe posting in an alien empire, and had received a shipment of protein and a formal representative status, and a regulatory amendment that applied to exactly one settlement. And that was not the same as being free, which she understood, but was also not nothing. It was 11 digits on a screen with a clock that ran 30 days. It was the next step, and the step after that, and the long work of making a strange place livable that her people had always been willing to do. She drew the stars. Outside the dome, through the translucent wall, the methane bog caught the morning light in copper and green. The same light it always was. The same bog. But the filter array was running clean because she'd fixed it, and the heating was reliable for the first time in 2 winters, because the maintenance convoy had come with actual replacement parts, and somewhere in the outer territories, a king in a traveler's coat was moving through the worlds he governed with a bent copper coin in his breast pocket. She hoped it was still there. She thought it probably was. 6 months after the claiming feast, a Dominion policy paper circulated through the administrative center's internal review system. It was not a high-priority document. It sat in the queue behind 14 more urgent matters, and attracted no particular attention from the senior advisors who scanned the subject lines each morning and decided what needed the king's review. The subject line read, Proposal for Pilot Representative Framework, Outer Rim Settlement Administration, with reference documentation from VASA 9, Settlement Designation 7 Outer 9. The senior advisor who put it in the low-priority queue was not incompetent. She was simply managing a volume of documentation that made careful attention to any individual item a luxury. She had been doing this for 11 years, and she had developed systems for managing the volume that were, by any objective measure, excellent. She had also developed the particular blindness that comes with excellent systems, a blindness to the things that don't fit the sorting pattern she'd built. The paper didn't fit. A fringe settlement pilot program was not the kind of thing that generally generated reference documentation. Reference documentation meant someone had been tracking outcomes over time, which meant someone had been thinking about this for a long time, which should have been a signal. She put it in the low-priority queue anyway. Cale pulled it out of the low-priority queue the following morning. He developed the habit, after certain experiences in certain territories, of checking the low-priority queue himself once a week. The senior advisor had once pointed out that this was not an efficient use of a king's time. Cale had agreed with her and kept doing it. He read the paper in his study, in the early morning before the first appointments of the day, with tea and the particular quality of silence that the study held before the court began its noise. The paper was well constructed, careful, evidenced, specific about what a pilot program would look like and what it would need and what success would mean. It cited the VASA 9 outcomes, the medical response, the supply correction, the communication charter amendment, the procedural notice that had resulted in a formal apology and supplemental allocation. It cited those outcomes not as triumphs, but as data points from which to extrapolate. The authorship field listed a colony administrator on VASA 9. The name below that was a Dominion Policy Research Fellow, a young Keth academic named Tesset who, the brief biography noted, had been working on fringe settlement policy for 3 years without finding traction in the administrative system, until 6 months ago when a formal representative filing from VASA 9 had been routed to his department, and he'd been assigned to follow up, and had instead found a decade of documentation that completely restructured his dissertation. Cale read the paper 3 times. He read the cited documentation once. He set it on his desk and looked at it for a moment. Then he moved it to the high-priority stack. The meeting with Tesset happened 4 days later. He was young, Keth young, which was to say perhaps 40, but with the particular energy of someone who'd been working on something they believed in for long enough to have the patience of someone twice that age. He presented his case for the pilot framework clearly, and without the nervous deference that made most young policy presenters hard to listen to. He'd done his research. He knew his numbers. There are 47 fringe settlements in the outer territories that meet the baseline criteria, he said, near the end. If the VASA 9 outcomes are representative, and the documentation suggests they are, a representative framework extended across those 47 settlements would reduce administrative overhead, improve resource allocation accuracy, and, he paused. And in the pause there was the particular hesitation of a person deciding whether to say the true thing that is also the harder thing. He said it. And reduce the rate at which people die of things that aren't supposed to kill them. Yes, Cale said. Tesset looked at him. He'd expected more response than that, clearly, either the supportive response or the pushback, either of which he'd prepared for. The single-word agreement with the full weight of what he'd just said was not something he'd prepared a follow-up to. It will take time, Cale said. The framework amendment to the charter will face resistance from the garrison administration structure, which benefits from the current ambiguity. The Resource Allocation Office will need restructuring to handle 47 new direct channels, which is a staffing question that will require at least 2 budget cycles. There are 3 territories where the political situation is complicated enough that I would want the pilot to proceed carefully, by which I mean that proceeding in the wrong order could make things worse for the people it's supposed to help. I know, Tesset said. I've tried to build that into the proposal's phasing. You have, Cale tapped the stack, not perfectly. Section 4 has a sequencing error. You've prioritized the settlements with the most severe deficits, which is the right moral instinct and the wrong strategic move. If the most difficult cases are the pilot cases and any of them struggle, the framework will be judged by its hardest tests before it's proven anywhere. Start with the mid-range. He paused. Then the hardest ones, with the infrastructure of the initial successes behind you. Tesset stared at him. He was recalibrating something rapidly. Yes, that's yes. Revise Section 4. Bring it back in 10 days. I'll have Joreth connect you with the Garrison Administration liaison so you understand the shape of the resistance before you put the final version in front of the review board. Cale looked at him directly. This gets done. I want you to understand that. The resistance is a problem to solve, not a wall. Solve it. Tesset left the study with the energy of someone who has had their work taken seriously for the first time at the scale it deserved. Cale watched him go and felt the precise satisfaction of watching momentum build in the direction it should be going. He went to his desk and took out a piece of correspondence paper, actual paper, which he used rarely enough that it retained a certain weight of intention when he did. He wrote a brief note, formal but specific, addressed to the colony administrator of VASA 9, informing her that a policy proposal based in part on her documentation had entered formal review, and that she would receive updates through her official administrative channel as the process developed. He signed it. He looked at the signature for a moment. Below it in smaller script he added, "The coin is still in my coat. K." He sealed the letter. He had it sent through the official dispatch. It would arrive in 17 to 22 days by the relay schedule, which meant it would arrive on a Tuesday or a Thursday, which meant she might be in the equipment bay with 11 children sitting on upturned storage containers when the terminal chimed. He thought about that. He thought about her pausing the lesson and reading the letter at the terminal in the corner, and then putting it aside and going back to the star maps. He thought she'd go back to the star maps. The letter arrived on a Wednesday. She read it twice at the terminal, carefully, and then a third time more slowly. She read the formal language about the policy proposal and the review process with the same attention she brought to supply manifests, reading for what the precision of each word meant and what it left room for. She read the addendum 3 times more than the formal text. She thought about the coin. She thought about where it was now, in the breast pocket of a traveler's coat that the most powerful individual in the galaxy had been wearing like a second-hand skin for 8 months, learning what indifference cost. She put the letter in the cabinet, not in the bottom drawer with the ledger, in the top drawer with the current administrative documents, with the correspondence that was ongoing and not finished. Then she went back to the whiteboard and kept teaching. The children that morning were working on the outer spiral cluster, the unofficial routes, the ones her father had mapped. She'd given them each a copy of the coordinates, printed on salvaged paper, because a navigator needed to be able to work from a document and not always from a board. They were cross-referencing the coordinates against the colony's nav terminal, finding each star, marking it on their own small maps with whatever they had to write with. One boy, 9 years old, with the serious eyes of a child who has understood early that the world requires taking seriously, asked, "Why don't these routes show up in the standard system?" She considered how to answer that. She'd been thinking about how to answer it for the 3 weeks she'd been teaching this section. "They were mapped before the standard system knew to look for them," she said finally. "They exist. They're real. We found them first. The system just hasn't caught up yet." The boy nodded and went back to his map. She looked at the ochre star maps on the whiteboard, at the children bent over their salvaged paper coordinates, at the cold dome outside, the methane bog in copper and green, the filter array running clean, the heating reliable, the supply crates counted and correct and full. The system catching up, one 11-digit case number at a time, one 30-day response clock, one policy review, one charter amendment, one procedural notice accepted and answered, slow and incomplete and ongoing and not finished. She picked up the chalk. The ochre was getting low. She'd need to find another source, or switch colors, or let the children learn to read the stars in whatever color she had left. She'd figure that out. She always figured that out. She kept drawing. Outside, the galaxy was large and mostly indifferent and full of routes that hadn't been officially mapped yet. In a breast pocket somewhere in the outer territories, a bent copper coin kept its warmth. On Vasa 9, in an equipment bay that was also a classroom, a woman with paper ledgers and electrical wire and 17 years of stubbornness that the Dominion had no category for drew the stars her people had found first. She drew them exact. She drew them true. She drew them the way you draw things that you intend to be there a long time after you are gone, which is carefully and completely and without stopping until they are right.